So what I'm hoping to do, this class is, you've read the Gospel of John many times. I grew up listening to my mother read it before I could read it. Not a lot of new information, but if you can catch a little bit of the excitement I have being able to teach, it's almost like the wings of an eagle stretching out and catching that lift of that warm air coming out in the morning and flying higher. So my hope is that even as we talk about this wonderful story written by Jesus' very best friend, your heart will be lifted up. Even if you don't have a single thing, well, I didn't know that was there, that kind of an event. So what we're doing, and to give you an overview of the next 2 weeks, this Sunday we're going to be talking about the last 6 of the signs that Jesus performed, that the writer of the 4th Gospel gave us as proofs of who he was. And the next week, I am going to skim over the top of the discourses. All right? The discourses you'll find in your papers. None of this is hidden. It's all in the book. But it's a little bit like I did the first Sunday. Right? I told about teaching small engine repair, taking the parts of the engine all apart, laying them on the table, and saying, here's what it takes to make an engine work. So what I'm doing is taking the book apart and saying, here are the things that make this thing so powerful. And it doesn't put them together for you. I could have 4 weeks just on the 3 chapters from John 13-17 on that last night of his life. But Pastor John's doing that downstairs anyway, so I'm not going to duplicate that. I'm not even going to refer to that necessarily. But this is looking at the parts and pieces, and then who knows, maybe next time we'll come together, we can put some of the things together and see how it makes it work. Okay? So starting with the second miraculous sign, if you remember, the first one was he turned water into wine. And what was the purpose of that? Well, so they could have wine in the wedding feast. I mean, that was pretty clear. But there was a second purpose. What was the second purpose? To show his divine creative power. I can do this. All I have to do is just call it into existence. And we can take chemicals that are in nowhere around, and suddenly they are in the places they need to be. And not only that, it's not the right chemical, not only the right chemical mixture, it's good wine, which takes time. And this was good wine. All right. But there was a third purpose to it too. And that was to prove that Jesus was even superior to Moses, because Moses had been the great lawgiver, the one who built the whole nation of Israel, and he had done many miraculous things, but Jesus said, even Moses testifies that I am greater than he. Okay? And the reason that Moses can say that is because he could tap the rock and water would pour out. Jesus spoke to the rock and wine came out of the stone jars. So it would be even more powerful to create wine than it is to find water in a very arid part of the world. Okay? There was a fourth reason as well. And this is new. The last phrase of that story, that account in the Gospel of John, says it this way. His disciples saw what he did and believed. Okay? What does that mean? Well, for John, having testimony, having legally qualified witnesses, is very important to proving who Jesus is. It's not just doing something. It's having witnesses that can verify that that's what was done. He did it, and this is the way it was done, and this is a truthful account. So while John says, I'm going to tell you only what I've seen and heard, he's certainly not going to be alone. So if we step backwards into the second chapter and say, okay, now how many disciples did Jesus have on the third day of his ministry? 3, 4, 5 maybe? He's just getting started. But those who were there, who were closest to him, saw what he did, and they could be witnesses. Now, as we go through the rest of the miraculous signs, you'll see that that circle of witnesses just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay? Until it gets to be huge. Let's just start with the next one, all right? We're turning to the 4th chapter of the Gospel of John. And we're starting in the 43rd verse. Jesus is in Galilee again. This is the second miraculous sign, so I've put a little number 2 in the margin of my Bible saying this is the second time he wanted to prove who he was. Verse 46. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Jesus said, unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe. To the royal official, he said, the royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. Go, Jesus replied, your son will live. The man took Jesus in his word and departed. And while he was still on his way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him. And the father realized that this was the exact time that Jesus had said to him, your son will live. So he and his whole family, household, believed. Okay? Now, that's the second miraculous sign. You ask yourself now, why is that important? What does that teach us? That's the first question we ask. What does this teach us? The second question after that is, how is that superior to Moses? The third question after that, how does this increase our circle of witnesses? How does this build the whole plan that John is working on as he tells his story? Well, the first one was, what force healed the son? What force healed the son? That's not automatically clear. Jesus didn't lay his hands on him. Jesus didn't make mud and put it on his eyes like he did other situations. So Jesus wasn't there physically, tangibly, like the lady who reached out and touched the hem of his garment, and power went out of him. So how did that work? How did that work?
Just like it works today.
Exactly the same. He is the commander and chief of a vast army.
The great physician.
And they do his will every time he says, there's one I want to take care of. All right? Now that has to link up with several other stories. If you remember in the 7th chapter of Matthew, there is a Roman centurion who comes to him with a servant who is very, very ill. And he says, I don't want you to come to my house. Being a Gentile, that would defile Jesus, and he wouldn't be able to be clean, ceremonially clean. So I don't want you to defile yourself coming to my house. All you have to do is say the words. And here's the way he explained it. You and I, talking to Jesus, are men under authority, and we are men of authority. And when I say to one of my soldiers, go here, do this, he goes and does it. And if I say to another one, here's what I want you to do, he goes and does it. So all you have to do is say the word, and it will be accomplished. See? Commander-in-chief. The same thing happened when Jesus was in conversation with Pilate, also in the Gospel of John. And Pilate, he was a bigwig. He had a lot of gravitas. He could make things happen. And he said to Jesus, don't you realize I have the authority that can have you killed? Now, in my mind, this is not scripture. This is a forewarning. This is not scripture. I see Jesus smiling at him and saying, Pilate, you are such a little man. Don't you understand that you, now this is scripture, hold on now, I just switched from one to the other. You only have authority from what has been given to you from above. You only have that much. It's not total, it's not complete, it's not 100%. The Caesar has put you into control of this community for this time to do this work. God has put you in this spot to make this decision. It's been given to you from above. And all you've got is just this little thing that is right now your authority that can change at any second. That's what the meaning is of that conversation he has with Pilate. And so Pilate is so impressed with the knowledge and the understanding that Jesus has that he writes on the plaque over his head, over the cross, King of the Jews. He knows what a commander-in-chief looks like, what they talk like, the way they operate. And he recognized Jesus as a king. In fact, even the palace guards that were sent to arrest Jesus came back to the high priest at one point in the scripture and says, you didn't bring him in. What happened? And they said to the high priest, no one we've ever heard speaks with the kind of authority this guy does. It's amazing. It's almost like he knows something that we don't know about. He is filled with authority. So on the second miraculous sign, when Jesus said, go, your son will live, and at that very moment, the boy was healed, the fever left him. That was the evidence that he was healed. The fever left him. It proved that Jesus was the commander-in-chief of a vast, invisible army. Now, how does that make him superior to Moses now? Moses was a commander-in-chief of an army too.
But they were all visible.
I'd have you come sit in the front row, man. I need a... The Israelites had to be trained to be an army. Moses had 40 years to work and practice and train and develop and bring up a whole bunch of leaders like Joshua and Caleb who can lead this gigantic people as they stormed across into the promised land. And they were disciplined enough they could walk around the city of Jericho and be quiet for 7 days. That's a pretty disciplined army. Not even the military when I was in there was that disciplined. They'd be out there complaining, "It's hot out here. What do you mean go around this? This isn't getting us anywhere." You know, they could have gone crazy. Because we're a bunch of sailors, so we're not Marines. All right. Jesus was the commander-in-chief. How did it increase the circle of the witnesses? Well, now there's a whole family who saw and understood and related to the fact that Jesus simply spoke the words, and all of the commanders in the heavenly host responded to do what he had commanded them to do.
As far as witnesses, it says that his servants were already coming to meet him. So they already had seen that he had lived, so they were part of the circle.
They were part of the circle too. And by the way, if you see that they didn't meet until the next afternoon, that was quite a distance. I mean, they weren't just next door. So it tells me Jesus has a worldwide reach with his orders and his instructions. You have any questions about that? That's number 2. We're moving on because I got only a half an hour for the last 4 or so. All right? Let's grab our Bibles and look at the third one. All right? And that happens first verse in chapter 5, the healing at the pool. Jesus has gone to Jerusalem now. Verse number 3 of chapter 5 says there was a great number of disabled people lying at the pool. They're the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And one who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, and he said, "Do you want to get well?" Now, I have a mental picture. It probably doesn't surprise you. I have a picture in my head of what he looked like. Okay? Because in the mid-1960s, I was in high school. I was very immature, but I did see a lot of things happen. And after church on Sunday morning, my dad would take us as a family to a home. It was just a regular house. It was in the time before nursing homes or, clinics and that kind of stuff, where you have a lot of nurses and medical equipment around and, like that. This was just a house. Good people in there, but they didn't have a lot of medical training. It was just a converted home where people who couldn't take care of themselves anymore came to live in the care of these people that loved and took care of them. And I had an aunt that lived there. Her name was Ivy Sechrist. And Ivy Sechrist had been a very small lady at the very beginning. But she had suffered most of her life with crippling arthritis. And we would go into that home and we would gather. Her little single bed type cot wasn't a hospital bed or anything sophisticated. It was just a low little cot set in what would have been just a slightly deeper than a closet, where she was kind of in this little niche along a hallway. And she laid there, always turned against looking at the wall, and her body had grown so disfigured that her hands were so pulled up inside they couldn't even get them open to trim her fingernails. And her wrists were pulled in this way, and her arms were pulled in this way, and she was rolled up into a fetal position with her legs almost against her belly. She was totally blind and almost completely deaf. And there she lay. And my dad, he was an evangelist and had a pretty powerful voice. In a register most people could hear from a long distance. And he was able to get his voice into her ears somehow, and she could respond. She was perfectly lucid. She could respond to any question he asked, but he was the only one she could actually hear enough to know what was going on. And he would talk with her. I imagine everybody in that little house could hear what was going on because he was bellowing. When I see the picture of this man who's been for 38 years lying beside the pool, I see him as this hunched back, twisted, picture of Aunt Ivy. Except instead of laying on a cot in the closet in the hallway, he's laying on a mat on a stone pavement next to a pool. Now, I'm not sure how well you picture this situation, but the pool of Bethsaida, where this is taking place, is just inside the city gate of the city of Jerusalem. And the wall of the temple, the north wall of the temple, is built right on the edge of the steps going down into this pool. And the temple sits up here with all of its thousands and thousands of worshipers. Jesus went to Jerusalem for festival times, so the city was full of people. Right? And the tradition was that, if you were really serious about your worship, you went down to the pool and you gave gifts to those who were disabled and couldn't get to the temple themselves and couldn't take care of themselves. So you would give gifts to the disabled before you went up into the temple to pray. Indication of what was in your heart. Okay? So in addition to all those people who were lame and deaf, paralyzed, all the different problems, there were all the people who were flowing down the steps into this cavity around this pool of water. And the crowd of people that are there watching, and they're wondering what Jesus is going to do. It's kind of an interesting question. Why would he go there? What's he going to give these people? What kind of gift is he going to give them? Coins? Folding money? Food? What is he going to do to give gifts to the disabled? And they're watching him. And Jesus is asking questions. Who's been here the longest? Who has seniority? Who's the most difficult? And they said, that guy over there, he's been here for 38 years. Jesus went to him and said, do you want to get well? Well, he's sitting beside the pool where people got well, got healed. Why wouldn't he want to get well? It seemed almost like a cruel question when I first read that. Aren't you insulting the guy? Well, anyway, I could preach a whole sermon just on that one, I guess. But Jesus says, stand up and walk. I gave you a picture of Aunt Ivy. Now get the picture of her arms being released, her shoulders being released, her neck being released, her hands being released, her legs being released, her back being released, and she stretches out to her full 4'8" height. And then turns and puts her feet on the floor, stands up on her own power, without a single touch by a physical therapist or surgeon or nurse. That's what everyone saw. Wasn't quite finished. Then Jesus said, roll up your bed, put it up on your shoulder, and go home. The reason why that's a miracle is because Jesus had to regenerate every muscle, every ligament, every fiber, and re-energize that entire structure in a moment of time. I've known a lot of physical therapists in my life, and they all have a great sensitive power of positive thinking. They all know they can fix it. You give me a little time, I can get you loosened up and we'll be doing great. I've never seen a physical therapist yet that wasn't gung-ho to get their hands on you and start to work. Let's get that thing pulled. Does that hurt you? Well, yeah, but you don't, no pain, no gain. Get that up there, move that. Oh, it wasn't like that for Jesus. We're not told he cried out in agony with any of those moves. Okay, why is that superior to Moses? Let's talk our second question. Help me.
Well, did Moses ever actually heal anybody?
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Moses never healed anybody that we know of. It's written in the scripture. He sent runners out with canters of incense to stop the plague. That's one of the stories. He set the pole up in the middle of the camp that stopped the serpents from killing people with the venom from the poisonous vipers. He did a lot of wonderful things. I don't remember a single experience.
I remember, I think it was Moses that either put his hand in his cloak or had somebody do that, and it came out and it was leprosy, and then it did it again and it was cleared
Perfect. That was at his call at the burning bush.
Yeah.
I can't do this. Put your hand in your cloak.
Right.
It was his own hand. All right, so healing someone who is in the worst possible situation has to be superior to Moses, because he didn't really do any of that. That wasn't in his calling. That wasn't within his framework of what he was doing as a people's leader. Okay, how does it increase our witness circle? Now, there's a big circle. It's a huge circle. These are people who are on their way to the temple. There are people on the stairways down into that, well, for want of a better picture, it was a deep pit. It was a pool of water at the bottom of a very deep trench. It was a valley, that's what it was, but from all appearances, you came through the city gates, and then you had to walk down these stairs to get down into that spot. You had to walk up the stairway to get back up to the temple, and the temple set up on top of a hill even besides that. So you were just outside the temple wall, but you were in a very different world. All of Jerusalem was abuzz with what had happened. Now, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? Why did Jesus get in trouble?
Because it's on the Sabbath.
It was on the Sabbath day. He would not have gotten in trouble if he'd have thrown a golden coin in that guy's cup.
Well, and the guy who was healed got in trouble for carrying his mat, too, because it was the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being amazed at what had happened, they got on it with the technicality.
You can do some things on the Sabbath. You can give coins to the poor. You can help someone into the pool. That's work. If the pool would have been stirred, nobody would have argued with anyone to step forward and help this guy down into the pool. But don't heal him. That's not legal. Oh, well, the rules that we make sometimes. Okay? 38 years. And Jesus meets him later and says, stop sinning, or something even worse could happen to you. Very ominous words. He's been laying beside the pool as an invalid. What kind of sinning could he have been getting into? Was he a drunk? Was he immoral? Well, no, he was stuck beside the pool 38 years. Come on. Must have been something.
Hanging around some daughters. Hanging around some daughters.
With doubters, yeah, that's for sure. I think the sin was in this little 6-inch space between his ears. Self-pity, rage, anger. I think the sin was in here. You got to get your... My dad used to call it stinking thinking. Stinking thinking. Oh, well, I'm running out of time again. Turning to chapter 6. Oh, this is an easy one. I shouldn't even mention this one. Jesus is preaching and teaching, and the whole crowd comes around, and they're hungry. And Jesus said, well, feed them. Now, you know that. That's so familiar, I'm not even going to read that passage. It's just simple, straightforward. 5,000 people, men at least, plus whoever else, have them sit down on the ground. 5 little barley loaves and 2 fish. Okay, let's just stop right here without going into it and say, how was that superior to Moses? Interesting question. Yeah, Moses prayed, and manna came every morning. Well, yeah, Jesus didn't make the thing either. He miraculously caused it to come. Please forgive me because I use a shorthand expression. Moses did it. Well, no, Moses prayed, and God provided. Jesus prayed, and God provided. It wasn't mechanical in the sense that Moses made the manna, and it wasn't mechanical that Jesus made the bread and the fish. But why is bread and fish superior to manna? Manna came from heaven, exactly. But in Jesus' case, he multiplied the food right there in front of thousands of witnesses who could watch it happen. How many people testify to seeing manna appear? We have no other testimony except the fact that they survived for 40 years on it. But we have no other record of, oh, I watched this morning at sunrise, and suddenly the angels came and dropped these little morsels for us to pick up, or something like that. It was like this mysterious, even manna itself means, what is this stuff? They knew what barley was. They knew what fish was. They knew that it had been prepared. You don't take barley and just make cakes out of it. It has to be ground up into flour. It has to be mixed up. It has to be cooked. It has to be, the fish has to be filleted, or you get bones in your gums. it has to be cooked. It has to be prepared. The little boy's mother had prepared him a sack lunch. And what they shared was exactly what this mother had prepared for her son. They knew what it was. But they knew that no Amazon Prime truck had drawn up and started unloading barrels of food. It just was made for them. All right? It was made for their benefit. Now, what did this do for the circle of witnesses? Wow! Now everybody knew it. It was like, wow, are you kidding me? 5,000 fish sandwiches?
Do you think that all 5,000 people knew about the miracle?
I think they watched it.
I mean, because that's a good-sized crowd, and could they actually see what was going on, or did they just go, oh, cool, fish sandwich?
An excellent question.
The ones close to Jesus, I'm sure, saw it.
But
and they
you see,
told them, but
they all knew they didn't bring food.
yeah, true.
They all knew that Jesus didn't bring food. They all knew they were all hungry. And there were no resources. And they all saw the disciples, according to one of the scriptures, handing out the bread from the baskets that they had been given. And the baskets never ran dry. You remember how many baskets were left over of the loaves afterwards?
12.
12 baskets full. How much manna was left over?
It died that day. None.
Manna rotted.
Yeah.
There was no take home. There was no leftovers for tomorrow. But they could take home 12 baskets for the trip back home. Well, every time we look at this, we go, this is even more important. It's even more miraculous, even more exciting to see what Jesus did. They were witnesses. Now we're getting more and more people. But I have to move on because we're coming up on number 5. Now this is all in connection to feeding the 5,000 people. And I don't think you want to miss this. So hang on, pay very close attention, because number 6 is not often spoken of. And the reason why is even people who've been Christians their whole lives don't believe it. Are you ready? Here's what he says. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. Now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. And he said to them, "It's I, don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Do you believe that? Most people go, well, I'm glad the wind blew them ashore.
But
The wind was against them one time, and now it's pushing them to the shore. What was that?
He calmed the sea before they got to the shore.
It doesn't say it calmed the storm. It doesn't say that. In one of the other stories in the other Gospels, everything was quiet. The other part of the story is that Peter got out of the boat and tried to join Jesus by walking on the water. that wasn't important to the writer of the fourth gospel. Well, he'd included it. What's the miraculous part of this story? Well, let's just stop for a second and get the geography right. The Sea of Galilee is a lake sort of like a meat platter. You got a big meat platter at home? All right, sort of an oval shape. Maybe you don't have a meat platter like that. We had a big one. We'd serve roast beef on there, all right? Well, the Sea of Galilee is not quite round, sort of an oval shape, and it's about 7 miles across. 7 miles. And these people knew the lake. You need to get a picture of the lake, too. The Sea of Galilee is like water in the bottom of a bowl that you'd have. There are mountains all the way around it, and the water lays sort of in the bottom. It's very cold. From the hill, the mountaintop of Mount Hermon, the snow melts up there on top of the mountain and runs straight down directly in the north end of the Sea of Galilee. It follows right straight down through the middle to make a cold passage right down through the middle of the lake, and then drains out in Jordan River, which is exactly on the south end. So it's a cold, deep lake in the middle with shallower areas along both sides. Okay? But what that means is when the wind is blowing, it doesn't blow this way because the mountains are there. The wind comes down and follows the slope of the mountains down to the level of the water. And then it's like a wooden spoon whipping on the top of a fluid down there, whipping up the water so that within just a few minutes it can go from being dead calm to being wild and crazy. Because the wind tears at the surface of the water and starts the waves flowing. All right? So the wind was against them. How far had they rowed? It says so, right there. About 3.5 miles. Where does that put them? In the middle of the lake. All right? 3.5 or 4 miles from shore, any place. Jesus comes walking out. It's just me. Relax. They let him in the boat, and what happens? Immediately what happens? They end up exactly at the point, instantaneously, at the point where they had been hoping to end up. 3.5 to 4 miles away. How many people have heard sermons on that? See, I told you. A lot of people don't believe it. They just don't believe it. Preachers don't believe it. People don't believe it. They just ignore it and walk on. Why? It looks too much like beat me up, Scotty. It looks too much like science fiction. It looks too much like fantasy to say, nah. It's too much. It's one step too far. But not for me. You know why? Because I know Jesus was proving he was superior to Moses. All right, now what did Moses do that was so significant?
Well, in terms of water, it's the parting of the Red Sea.
You watch the movie,
Yeah.
Charlton Heston holding his rod out over the water. When the wind comes, and the water's piled up on both sides. It's an amazing picture I have in my head. Again, another one of them. And down through the middle they walk. Okay? this is pretty amazing, but as it is, Jesus doesn't even bother the fish. He just walks over the surface of the water in total control. I mean, the laws of physics, specific gravity and all the other laws that we have, all say that you can't do that. But if you can believe he walked on the water, which most of us will say, yeah, I believe that. There's enough stories about that. Well, a lot of sermons about that. About Peter sinking. Lord, help me. We all realize we've got that one in our heads, all right. Well, if he can set aside the laws of physics and walk across the surface of the water instead of having to part the sea to get from one side of the Galilee to the other, he can also affect the laws of time and space. Imagine if Moses would have said, God, I would like for you to take my people from one side of the Red Sea to the other side of the sea without walking. Would you please do that? Could he have done that? Absolutely. If Jesus could do it with his disciples 3.5 to 4 miles, including the boat, I'm sorry, I have to include the boat. He could have transported millions of Israelites and their flocks and their wagons and their pets from one side of the Red Sea to the other. Why didn't he? Because it had to be a witness, a testimony for all time. It had to be a testimony by the people to their descendants for all time. And you can't just say, well, we all kind of fell asleep, and when we woke up, we were on the other side of the sea. They had to actually walk it. They had to actually participate in going from one side to the other. They had to do the work and then watch the chariots and the horses be drowned as they tried to follow.
Yeah,
Had to do that.
I was going to say it was also setting a trap for the Pharaoh and the army.
Exactly the same.
Because had they just been transported across, the Egyptians never would have gone into the water.
Straight in. All right. So what I'm trying to say to you is, don't be limited in your ability to listen to what the word says. They went 3.5 to 4 miles in the flashing of a blink of an eye together when Jesus said, let's go. Okay? So let's do one more. Let's do one more. The 6th miraculous sign happens. Let me get back here where I get it. Oh, yeah. All right. This is a powerful one. The entire 9th chapter is the 6th miraculous sign. The boy who was born blind. And this is the one where Jesus spits on the ground, takes the clay that he's made, the mud, puts it on his eyes and tells him to go wash. And his sight is restored. Let's start with our questions. How is this superior to Moses? What's the specifics of it? Jesus is actually confronted by his disciples saying, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Do you get the picture of what they're asking? Do you understand what they're asking? Syphilis was a problem in Jesus' day. And if you were an immoral person, promiscuous, it was very common for children to be born with the syphilis bacteria in their eyes. That was a part of the birth process. It just happens that way. But the person that's being born, the baby that's being born, is not immediately blind. It happens over time. And a cloud comes over the eyes and then they can't see. This is a child who was born blind. How do you know if a baby can see or not? They always have this weird look. Their eyes don't always work together, and it takes a while for them to get kind of focused. You know, you click your fingers or whistle or something, they'll look sideways or something at you. They'll see a bright light and they'll follow it. How would you know, absolutely know without any question, that a baby is blind from birth? Movement? I think it's even deeper than that. I think he didn't have the equipment. I think he was deformed enough that the midwife who was taking care of this child looked at this child at the moment of birth and said, this child will never see. It's the only way he could have the name, the boy who was born blind. I call him the boy with the misshapen eyes. When I actually have a sermon where I become him and I tell my story. Kind of a pretend story. How is that superior to anything Moses did? Well, Pharaoh was blind by his own selfishness and by his own power and his own self-delusion that he thought he was the most powerful guy around. So Jesus does go ahead and tell about people who are willfully blind. And the mere fact that Pharaoh finally got smart enough to let the people go isn't really a sign that he got his vision. It's just vastly superior to what anything that Moses would have done, physically healing someone. And the miracle had to be investigated. I'm very glad they investigated. I'm glad they doubted it. Because they called in everyone. They called in people who knew him, beggars who had been at the same street corner as he'd been, you know, all the way through his life. There were people who had seen and witnessed this guy who was so tragically deformed, they called him the man born blind. The man born blind. This was his moniker. It was his identity. The man who was born blind. Who sinned? This man or his parents? And Jesus said, this is so that God can show what he can do. It's simple. This happened so that God could show his miraculous authority. And I guess the thing I would say is, I even like the fact that Jesus made mud and put it on his eyes. Because it had been really freaky for somebody to have watched them happen, where new eyes were slowly created or instantaneously created in this face that had been so deformed. We were spared a little of that, that's creepy, kind of a thought, because Jesus put clay over the eyes and let the miracle happen. They called in all the experts, they called in his parents, they called in everybody, they investigated everything. Yes, this is our son. Yes, he was born blind. He is no longer deformed, but that is still our son. How did this increase the circle of witnesses? Now, even those who were in authority were beginning to see the miracle for themselves. They didn't believe it. They rejected it. It was another one of those things that divided the community. You can't do that stuff on the Sabbath day. You can't do that.
I think that's why some of them said, yes, it is him, and others said no, because he looked so different.
He looked so different. He had eyes now. He could actually look at you and see. Understand, one of my first responsibilities was to be chaplain in a hospital, and they sent us into the operating room to see what people went through when they had surgery. It was to help sensitize us, I guess. And I watched them do an eye surgery on a little girl whose eyes were crossed. And they went in and surgically took about that much of the muscle on one side of her eye that was too weak and shortened it and clipped it back together. And as soon as they released the stitches, her eyes were straight. It was wonderful. But you know what they told me? We have to be very proactive, because the nerve that feeds the sensations from the back of the eye to the brain are very immature at birth. Very immature at birth. As you watch, as you see through your eyes, the nerves that run from the eye to the brain grow and develop and mature, and they get more robust. When we were expecting our first child, we painted all of the spokes in the baby crib different colors, primary colors, all of them. Just so that as this kid was falling asleep, he'd be peeking out through his eyes going, wow, this is crazy. I'm in a crazy world. Look at all that stuff. And his visual stimulation would be excited by the colors and the stimulation of seeing all these primary colors all the way around him. We wanted healthy, robust eyes, vision. If you've been blind from birth, not only do you not have eyes behind those eyelids, even if you have eyelids. I'm not sure how he was deformed, but it was pretty gross. You don't have the nerve that goes from there to the brain. It has shrunken up and shriveled down to where it does not exist even. Jesus had to not only create eyes from nothing, he had to create the nerve and the connection and the facility within the brain to be able to recognize what you'd never seen. Which was obvious from the way the boy responds when he finally gets his vision. Okay, now I am completely out of time. I'm past. I'm sorry. I apologize. Can we close with a word of prayer? Lord Jesus, I pray a simple prayer. May our hearts be stirred up inside of us by what we have felt, what we've seen, what we've listened to. Let our minds and our hearts bond together with a certain joy that wells up within us to say, this is one awesome Lord that we serve. Help us to not be afraid to say, I believe it 100%, even though it goes against everything I've ever learned or known or seen or experienced or have happened to me. I am completely taken back by some of the things I've learned, but help me to believe more completely and be excited about what you've done for us. And we'll give you the praise and the honor and the glory, Lord, from this moment forward, because you've opened our eyes like you did with the man born blind to see you more clearly, and we can worship you more completely. Amen. Thank you, thank you, thank you.